Hello, welcome back to Phil 375. I hope everyone's been able to have a little bit of a break over the reading week and that you're able to come back into the course refreshed. We are moving into our week of discussing Iris Murdoch's novel, The Philosopher's Pupil, which, not going to lie, I'm pretty excited about. Just before we get started talking about the book itself, I wanted to say a couple of things about the essay questions. Hopefully by now you all are starting to think about the essays, and those of you who haven't had a chance to look at them yet, definitely get on that. So the essay rubric is available on Canvas. You can, if you navigate to the Canvas website and you go down to the section called Syllabus, you'll find a link there that's just called Essay Rubric. Click on that link and it will take you through to a description of exactly what's necessary for the essay, or essays. If you prefer to do two short ones, you can do that. I'll just say a couple of quick things to clarify. The questions are, there are 6 different questions there that are set. If you're doing one essay, you pick one of those questions, and if you're doing 2 essays, you can pick 2 of those questions. The only requirements in terms of citation of particular course text are that one of your essays, if you're doing 2, or your essay, if you're doing 1, must talk about one of the novels. So either Sartre's La Nausea or Iris Murdoch's The Philosopher's Pupil has to show up somewhere. But beyond that, you're free to talk about anything else that we've studied in this course. As I think I've said in the video specifically about the essays, you can bring in other content and references if you want to, but that's not a requirement. However, the requirement to talk about at least one of the novels, one of the full-length books that we've studied in this course, is one that you should be aware of. I don't think I need to say anything more specifically about that at this time, but if you do have further questions, of course, feel free to email me, or if you want someone to talk about your essay with you, then feel free to email Jelena, our TA, and she can sit down and chat through your choice of essay questions with you. So let's move on to talk about Iris Murdoch. So you've met Iris Murdoch already. She was in that video that we watched right at the beginning of the class, talking about philosophy and literature and their relationship to one another, or as she sees it, their complete lack of relationship to one another, their complete separateness and distinctness, as far as she's concerned. So who is she more generally? She is a near contemporary, so she died in 1999, and she was 80 years old. She was born in 1919. She lived a fascinating life. Those of you who get interested in Iris Murdoch and fall down this rabbit hole, you're in for a treat. She's a very, very interesting woman. She was married to another scholar, so she was a philosopher, an academic, for part of her life, at least herself, and she was married to another academic, John Bailey, also an Oxford prof, and they had a very happy marriage. Iris Murdoch also was involved in relationships with other people, both men and women, throughout her married life, and Bailey was aware of these. So there's another kind of fascinating facet of this character. She died of, she had Alzheimer's in her later years, and she was very famously portrayed in a movie that came out quite shortly after her death in 2001 by Judi Dench and Kate Winslet. So Kate Winslet plays the young Murdoch, and Judi Dench plays the old Murdoch. And this movie, it's just called Iris. It was based on the retrospective account of their relationship that Bailey wrote after Murdoch died. It's actually a very good movie, and as far as I know, reasonably accurate as far as these things go. So again, those of you who are interested in who Iris Murdoch was, there's one perspective, obviously, just one via her husband, but an interesting one, I think. So what was she up to in her thoughts processes and her philosophical work? Let's talk about that for a minute, and then we can come to this specific book. So very broad brush strokes. Iris Murdoch was very interested in morality, good and evil, right and wrong. She was broadly speaking a Platonist about goodness, so she thought there was such a thing as the goodness, and perfect goodness is different from anything that's sort of instantiated in real human beings. What real human beings can do to try to improve morally, she thinks, is that we have to overcome our ego centered view of the world and our selfishness, effectively. And what she suggests for a method of doing this is that it's all about directing our attention. So this is a process that she sometimes calls unselfing. So directing attention to what's really true in the world, and not just the biased and self-interested version of it that we are, as she sees it, naturally predisposed to generate for ourselves. That is mostly illusory, or lots of it is illusory, and it is attention, and specifically loving attention to reality, directed to try to make us better people, that will in fact make us better people. This is a very interesting claim in and of itself. It also, I think, although she denies any influence of her philosophy on her novels, I think you'll see it in The Philosopher's Pupil, and I think you'll see it in lots of her fiction as well. So the kinds of things that one can do in the process of unselfing for Murdoch would include things like appreciating art or beauty, contemplating, reflecting on the qualities of those things, and unselfing through that kind of attention as a kind of practice to become better at directing loving attention to other people generally and the world. She thinks the same thing can be done through earnest prayer and things like meditation and processes like that enable us to work with our attention and direct it in more moral ways onto reality, and to stop it from kind of getting bound up with our own egotistical concerns. She is quite influenced by a Freudian conception of psychoanalysis. So those of you who know a little bit about Freud, it may be interesting to know that she is in some ways in dialogue with that conception of the ego. She complicates it. Certainly when you read The Philosopher's Pupil, I think it's pretty clear that there's more complexity going on there than just, say, a simplistic Freudian Oedipus complex or something like that. But there is still certainly an influence of Freud, and her main concern as far as her ethics goes and morality goes is all about this seeing past the illusions created by our selfish ego through this directing of our attention, loving attention onto the real world and things and people as they really are. That's probably enough background for now about Murdoch, but as I say, those of you who get interested, you are really in for a treat. So there's much more to be found down that road. Let's talk about the book that we're reading. I won't, for those of you who haven't finished yet, this will be spoiler free. This is a book that really genuinely can be spoiled. There's a lot of plot and twists and turns, and certainly the momentum of it really accelerates throughout, and towards the end of the book especially. That there's what seemed to be this must be the final climax every couple of pages, and it just keeps going. So there's a bit of a roller coaster of stuff there. So I'm not going to spoil things. I will say this. So in some ways, this novel can feel, although it was written in the 80s, it can feel a little bit old-fashioned, and that's partly to do with the kind of omniscient narrator figure, who seems to be able to describe everything that's going on inside everybody's head, and also this kind of large ensemble cast. So compared to Sartre's Nausea, right, where we had a very intensively one-man focused book, right, just Quentin and his inner life, that was the novel. Instead, with Iris Murdoch, what we see is this massive cast of characters all kind of tumbling out onto the stage at once like a kind of farce and interacting. And that, I think, is a very interesting, I mean, even if you thought nothing else about this, that in itself could be seen as an unselfing move, right? Stop focusing on just this one guy, who is in some sense possibly just a stand-in for Sartre's own self, the author's own self, and move away to the reality, which is that there is a tumble of different actors and characters involved in life or Murdoch's novel all at once, with their own different takes, different perspectives, different motives, different drives that the characters, may themselves be aware of or not. And so one thing I'll say is that these ways in which it is a little bit, it looks back to older literature, more like Victorian style writing, doesn't feel like the 1980s sometimes. That can make it a little bit harder to get into at first, especially because parts of the beginning of the novel are pretty slow. And there's not a lot of plot going on, but you do get introduced to this sort of intricate web of family relationships and connections, and you might find, some of us find that quite disorienting at first, and it's difficult to get into the book. If that's you, don't worry, because it's going to get so much better soon. And in fact, as soon as you get past, I would say the first quarter or so, first third maybe of the book, the pace really picks up, and things get once it gets going, it's going, and you're on the train, and the plot itself will kind of sweep you from that point onwards. What the only other thing I want to say sort of at this stage about the novel, obviously by the time we get to the wrap up at the end of this week, we'll talk about all of it, including all of the things that would right now be spoilers. So what I wanted to do for this part is to suggest a number of things that, as you read or reread The Philosopher's Pupil, you might keep an eye out for, or you might kind of track them and see what Murdoch is doing with them in this book, because there's some absolutely fascinating, I don't quite want to call them themes, but strands. If you follow them through the book, you can see her doing some very interesting things with them. There's actually a very long list, so I'm going to sort of tell you them now, and you can, I wouldn't recommend focusing on all of these things at once, actually. So if there's something on the list that kind of grabs your attention, then a good thing to do is take that and then read or go over the book with that theme or strand or thought in mind. And I would only do that with one or maybe two maximum at a time. So don't try to look for everything on the list at once, because you'll get that kind of overwhelmed feeling. This is a list that comes out of multiple sort of attempts to understand what's important in Murdoch's book. So the first thing you can look for is pretty obvious: the narrator, this character that they call themselves N, and they name the setting Ennistone after themselves. So look out for what Murdoch does with the narrator. What kind of narrator is this? What are the devices that she Murdoch uses to have this narrator presence in the novel. And you can also ask if you think it's a good idea. So this is one of the ways in which the novel, I think, could be criticized. It could be critiqued. Was it a good choice that she made to have that narrator be involved in the way that they are, as a member of the cast, right? As one of the characters on stage, as well as this kind of omniscient presence. So that's one kind of question. Different kind of question. Look at all the ways. So Iris Murdoch often loves to bring water in to her books and her thinking and her novels. So look at all the work that water is doing in The Philosopher's Pupil. And, you know, if we wanted to think about the psychological, psychoanalytic connotations of water, there are many that we could obviously think of, but some of the obvious ones are emotion. So thinking about sort of the way that water in the novel relates to, especially things like temperature, the role of hot and cold water, ice and steam in the novel. Look out for all of those things when there's pressure and release of the water, as a kind of potentially metaphorical symbol. Look out for all of those things. But also the role that it might play in signifying emotion, including perhaps emotion that's under pressure or repressed, and what happens when that is released or explodes. So that's one other important thing, I think, to be aware of in this book. Another theme around getting more close now to what is in Murdoch's official philosophy, so the things she calls her philosophy. Look out for the situations where people are or are not able to attend to one another. The characters being able to hear each other or not able to hear each other, being able to understand or not able to understand one another, their ability or inability to communicate to each other, even on matters of sometimes the gravest importance. And sometimes, like, literally questions about the characters using their voices in different ways, or deciding not to use their voices. Look out for that, because I think that really relates to this idea of unselfing and the role of loving attention to others in Murdoch's moral theory. Other things you can very, very definitely watch out for are the roles being played by power, and especially power over other people, and how that gets bound up with social status and class and race, and gender and sexuality in the book, and especially how it gets bound up with the role of philosophy in the book, and what kind of power philosophy has or ultimately doesn't have. So you can think in some ways of the philosopher character, the titular philosopher, as representing something about philosophy in Murdoch's novel. It'd be very hard for him not to, because he is made into a philosopher, and he does sound like what she would have encountered as a stereotypical philosopher of her era. Does to my ears anyway. Her era is not so very different from mine. And I sort of recognize this kind of character, and so watch out for how philosophy plays into his status, his power, and his wisdom or lack thereof, his awareness or self-awareness or lack thereof, and how that relates to everything that's going on with the water and the pressure and the steam and the eruptions and so on. Some other strands or themes that you could watch out for: age and youth. How are things like age and youth relating to one another? You often see this kind of high contrast: age and youth, hot and cold. Things that Murdoch, I think, is obviously presenting as in high contrast with one another. The role of family. Hugely important in this book, and again connected, I think, to this unselfing process. So what does it mean to think of a family unit as maybe an extended self? And is that a way of unselfing because you connect yourself to others and you see them and you pay loving attention to them? Or is it perhaps just an extended way of being selfish because you're being selfish now about your family as opposed to the rest of the world? But the way that Murdoch understands family and sort of grapples with evolving conceptions of what a family is, I think is really fascinating. In some ways, quite forward-looking for her time. So this is written in the early 1980s. So that's that's something that I think has become more of a discussion point now than perhaps it was then. The role of obsessive thinking, the role of innocence and purity or purification or cleanliness, the role of foxes and other non-human animals. Any of these are things that you could trace, I think, throughout this book and write an entirely fascinating essay about any one of them. So I could say more, but I'll stop there. I've got a huge list. But those are just a few that I'm throwing out there. You should probably be able to identify more too, because it's not. I think it's not a novel that tries hard to conceal what it's doing. It's pretty blatant with the imagery, with the water and the steam and the hot and the cold, and the role of family is very explicitly discussed many times throughout the novel, and of course it centers family groups very prominently. So I don't think it's being subtle about these things, but I think they're important, and I think they relate back to Iris Murdoch's own thinking and her philosophy, which of course brings me full circle back to that original interview in which we saw Iris Murdoch saying, "My novels have nothing to do with my philosophy. It's a complete accident that there happen to be philosophers and philosophy in them, and that's just because it's what I knew about, and I would have written about boats if I knew about boats or whatever." I can't I can't believe her, to be honest, that she says that. I'm not sure whether she really believes it herself. Maybe she did, and the fact that her novel is so, as I would say, philosophical, is just it just kind of bubbles out of her like the steam that can't be repressed anymore. It bubbles out into her novels, or whether maybe, and this is purely hypothetical, she thought that telling people her novels were philosophy would put people off buying them. I don't know. or there could be all kinds of other explanations for what's going on there. But what I think is pretty clear is that this is a novel where philosophy plays important roles, and I think you'll see them, and it's not subtle when the philosophy comes up. It's very explicit on many occasions. And it's a plot driver. It's not an accident. It's really relevant to what happens in the novel. Some people consider it to be funny. So lots of people describe this as a sort of dark comedy of a novel. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, kind of farcical. Certainly in its pace and complexity, there are farcical elements. So one thing that would be interesting to discuss, I think, is whether you will agree with that assessment, whether you find it funny, and if it is funny, how does it achieve that? We can also, I think, usefully ask the same kinds of questions we've been asking all along about different kinds of literature and text, insofar as we find this successful as a piece of, as just a novel, or as a philosophical novel, or as philosophy, what makes it so? So if you find this novel gripping to read, what's making it gripping to read? If you find that it does a good job of getting across some philosophical ideas, how's it managing that? Or contrary-wise, if you think it's a terrible novel, what's wrong with it? Why is it failing? If you think that there's that it does a much worse job conveying philosophy than if Murdoch had just written down a few sentences explaining clearly what she means, then why is this a worse way of doing that? I want to get into those deeper analytical aspects And this novel, I think, really just gives us. We've kind of been working up to this, so we've trained ourselves on Star Trek and even to a certain extent Sartre, because Sartre, of course, is a weighty philosophical novel, but far more worked over already, because it's more of an established classic, and in some ways a much less complicated book than The Philosopher's Pupil. So we've set ourselves up for this point now where we can get into this, I think, very substantial book, with a lot of experience, all the way up from discussing, Aesop's fable of the hare and the tortoise, up to this novel and its philosophical contents, or lack of philosophical contents, if you agree with Iris Murdoch herself. Okay, I won't go on too much longer. I will be opening up the threads for Murdoch Week later on today, and I'll be following along with interest as we discuss this week. Just to reiterate once more, please be thinking about the essays and the essay questions. Do get in touch with me or Yelena if you have any questions about the essay process. And I will see you all on Friday for the wrap-up as usual.